Hello everyone, and welcome to Fara's Carrier Guide. Today we're going to be talking about episode 6, Advanced Tactics. Specifically due to the number of topics covered, we're going to be taking it in sectional elements. So this episode specifically is about Advanced Bombing, so that's 6.1. The following episodes will cover elements such as neutralizing enemy AA, advanced fire control, and so on. So we're going to break the episodes down so that rather than long hour-long segments, we'll try and keep it shorter so that you can watch specifically what it is you're after in terms of the advanced tactics section. So with further ado, advanced bombing, what do I feel topics within this area cover? Well, today we're going to talk about unavoidable ultra-close range torpedo bomber strikes, approaching from behind an enemy's player's camera or point of view, cross-dropping destroyers and other fast ships, how one might evade cross-drops if you're the topic itself, the target itself I should say, blind attacking smoke targets, forcing ship turns, so you can hit somebody or so they expose broadside, defensive fire baiting, and damage over time stacking along with return flight paths. So that being said, let's go into our classroom today. The usual format is we talk about it in the classroom, which is the WoW's tactics map, and then we'll go into a random battle and apply what we've learned. So here we go. This is our training room. So today, or in this particular element, we're going to talk about approaching from behind the enemy player's point of view. Now, the reasons why you might do this tactic are if our carrier isn't to the north, our planes can be coming from the north, coming south. The enemy cruiser in this particular instance is focusing firing on our friendly ship. Could be a cruiser, doesn't really matter what it is. The point is that we know that the hostile ship is firing in the direction of north-ish, and his camera is looking at the cruiser. So if our planes to come directly at the cruiser, the enemy ship can take actions such as Alt or Control left clicking on our planes to do more damage, turning on a defensive fire, taking evasive maneuvers, turning, popping smoke, a whole host of options if he's paying attention, and you're making it kind of easy for him if you fly straight at him with planes. However, if you know that the enemy ship is firing at a friendly ship and that the guns are in one direction, odds are that he's not looking behind him. He's firing in one direction, he's not looking from behind. So if you are able to come from behind, he may be looking at the minimap, he might not, and attack the enemy ship from behind the player's, not behind the ship, but behind the player's camera, then there is less time for the player to react. And if you're fortunate, the only time he knows he's being attacked is when he hears the torpedo warning signal and he takes damage. This is really just an element of reducing the time that the enemy ship can react. The player, that is, himself can react, can click on your planes, can increase his damage, can increase his AA, or can mitigate the damage he takes from you. So if you come from his blind side, then we can do more damage. And that's what I mean by approaching the enemy player from behind, and we mean behind the camera specifically. We're still coming in, as we learned from plane control under bombing setups, coming at a 90-degree angle or slightly from behind and attacking the target. But the intentions were coming from behind the player camera. And if we know where the player camera is because he's focused on shooting a duel with another ship, then we can come at him from behind. The next topic we want to talk about is firing into enemy smoke. So in this particular element, it can be a high risk or higher risk maneuver because we do not know where the enemy ship is. The enemy ship is concealed in smoke. There's no hydro, there's no radar, there's no proximity spotting, so we don't know where the enemy ship is. However, we do know that he is firing at a friendly ship. So there's constant fire coming at. Now this might be a British cruiser, it could just be any ship that's using a destroyer smoke field, or it could be a destroyer. If we know that, alright, he's continuing to fire, he's not stopping, and our bombers are close, let's zoom in really close and watch the firing marks in. And then eye the area where he is. Has he moved? Are all guns firing broadside? Is it just nose guns? Look at the minimap. What was the ship it is? Do you know what ship's in the smoke? Can you guess what it is? Can you know how long it is? Is he firing longitudinal or horizontally? You know, guess the ship composition, because we want to torpedo bomb the smoke in a wide pattern, so not torpedo bombers on top of each other, but rather on a wide pattern, and just basically allow the torpedoes to spread out. It's even easier if we are a higher tier 9 or 10 aircraft carrier, because we have a third wave from the Taiho or the Kyoryu. So if we know that he's constantly firing, and we can guess what type of ship he is, and we can guess the orientation of the ship's broadsides, we can send the planes into the smoke, dropping at, you know, just outside the minimum range, and then having a wide spread, we can get a couple of connections. Looking at where the torpedoes actually make physical connections, if we have dive bombers close by, we can then also drop on where the torpedoes dropped. Now, this is kind of high risk in that, you know, there's every opportunity that the enemy ship sees your planes incoming and turns or runs away. You wouldn't normally do this. Normally, you would use the dive bombers to scout the smoke, and you would wait for the smoke to dissipate. However, there are certain circumstances where the enemy continues to fire in smoke, makes himself an easy target, doesn't move, and you think, you know what? I could kill him. You know, he's making this easy for me. I could get him. Or perhaps the game is slightly more desperate. You're short in time. Maybe you're down on points. Maybe the enemy's better to win. These are techniques that can help by looking at the enemy, how he's behaving, what type of ship he is, or that you think he is, how you think he's aligned, and then going in for a smoke attack. The next topic I want to talk about is cross-dropping. Now, this is the technique for attacking destroyers, primarily destroyers, but also fast cruisers and the like. So the standard technique that I personally use that works for me, now I know other people do it slightly differently, is step one, we have both torpedo bombers close by. We want to approach the destroyer from behind. So we have both torpedo bomber waves approach the destroyer from behind, and then we have one wave peel off so that we can get a 90-degree perpendicular angle. The first torpedo bomber wave drops its payload, which is represented by these 4 yellow arrows, so that they chase the destroyer. The reason we want it to chase the destroyer is so that the destroyer cannot turn left or right, because they'll panic. They don't want to clip any of the torpedoes, so they'll outrace them. They know if they keep going straight, they won't take any hits. So he'll keep racing, and he'll keep racing ahead of the torpedoes. At that point, we want the second wave to turn around and come down, and while the destroyer is locked into his position, we release the second wave so that he is stuck, not on a perfect kind of X drop, but like one coming in from his rear and one coming in from his side. Now the destroyer, if he continues to sail straight, will clip the second or the third torpedo. If the destroyer hard turns left, he may avoid, depending on his speed, the 2 rear topmost torps, but will clip into the side front 2. If he turns away from the right and tries to escape this way, he'll probably clip the 2 rear torpedoes on the south from his rear, or he may then drift into the edge torpedoes from the perpendicular angle. Now, this isn't a fail-safe technique. Very fast destroyers, specifically the Russian branch and those that use engine boost, are very fast, and if you are a destroyer player or a cruiser and you want to evade this technique, the goal is to kind of slowly drift out and then around, or to dead stop. If you know you're coming in a cross drop here, as soon as the rear torp happens, kill your speed immediately, and then as soon as you see the player drop, you kill your speed, and then you either don't take a hit or you take 1 torpedo hit. As the destroyer, the cruiser player, you are going to take damage. If you try to avoid taking damage, by trying to avoiding taking damage, you take all the damage and you die. If you know that you're going to probably just take 1 torp, that's fine. Slow down, drift out, take a single torp after he's dropped the second payload, and then turn away and move. Now, as the carrier player, if the destroyer keeps going quickly and then is going in a straight line, he is not going to move left or right. He's flying in a predictable path. You can use a dive bomber on the destroyer while you're doing the other drops. Alternatively, if the destroyer slows down and comes to a stop, and you've already dropped the second torpedo bomber wave, because if he comes to a stop and you haven't dropped the second torpedo bomber wave, then it's fine. You just torp the stationary destroyer. However, if you've dropped both waves and you don't have any other torpedo bomber waves, and the destroyer is coming down to a slow and a stop, well, now it's a stationary target. This is why you have the dive bombers loitering from behind, and you come in and you get some easy hits. You might not kill the destroyer, but you might get some incapacitations, some module knockouts, you might cause some fires. If you get a hit with a torpedo bomber and you cause some flooding, well, you know he'll damage con it, then you can follow it with a dive bomber, cause some fires afterwards, and that will increase his detectability. So this is the fundamental basics of cross-dropping. It takes a lot of practice. I myself mess up plenty of times. Torpedo acceleration helps immensely the captain skill, mainly because if it is a good enemy player that you're playing against, a good enemy destroyer player, he will know how to dodge. If he's fast, he can just outrun the torpedoes and then outrun the next torpedoes, or he can outrun, drift out before you even do the second drop. A good player can dodge when he has speed on his side quite effectively. Which is why torpedo acceleration, with the extra 5 knots, bumping the 34 or 35 knot torpedoes up to 39 or 40, means that the discrepancy of speed is reduced and that it's easier to keep the destroyer in, because he can go at full speed in a straight line, but as he starts the hard turn, he kills off his speed and the torpedoes catch up. Now, you can argue that I don't want to use torpedo acceleration, I would like to use Expert Gunner or another skill and still cross drop, and that is fine. You can still drop from behind, but you drop the torpedo bombers much closer behind the destroyer. And the flanking torpedo wave, because the torpedoes are slower, you'll have to drop them further ahead to guarantee a hit on the destroyer. A destroyer that's very fast, you can't drop perpendicular in angle, you have to drop way in advance, so that as the destroyer keeps going, he would sail into the torpedoes further away because of his great speed. The risk there is that the faster the destroyer is, he can see these much further away torpedo bombers and then just turn away. You can just turn out and drift. So it's very difficult to hit very fast destroyers, but torpedo acceleration helps. It is very easy to hit bad players, and you can fall into the lull sensation that, well, you know, I don't need this skill because, you know, I hit everyone all the time anyway. Well, that's dangerous, because if you're playing ranked or competitive and the skill ceiling that you're playing against is much higher, then you want to have the skill because it increases your capability to more reliably make hits or a kill on a destroyer, which has a really large impact on the battle. So here we have a lone Benson, Fubuki, in a random battle. He seems to be isolated, so we're going to approach him from behind and perpendicular. Keep our dive bombers ready. Oh, we did a spin. He's killing off his speed, but that's fine, because now we can cross-drop him. There was a strafe, but it's too late. He's stationary, we can do some dive bombers, we get a hit. So in this particular instance, the enemy destroyer slowed down rather than making a turn, but that's fine because we had our second bombing wave. We would have clipped him with one of the noses anyway. We're able to come in, do the side drop, finish him off. So that is cross-dropping in a nutshell. You come up from behind, force him so he can't turn left or right, and then come in from the side with another torpedo bomber wave. You catch him in a position where he can't move. If he does stop, you can realign the second wave to drop him if you haven't already done so, or you can use your dive bombers to punish the destroyer who's stationary. It helps if your fighters are around, try and avoid a strafe, but if you feel like they're going to get the hit in, then just go for it. Right, moving on to our next set of slides. First things first, let's talk about damage over time stacking. Now, what do I mean by damage over time stacking? Well, if I am using a carrier with particularly sturdy or strong planes, and by that I mean not the Hiryu, basically. The Hiryu has tier 6 torpedo bombers, they're quite fragile, you have to usually send them in together at the same time, otherwise they can be destroyed by hostile anti-air very, very quickly. If we're using something like the Shikaku, Taiho, Hakuryu, that type of thing, or even the Ryujo against lower AA targets, if we send against a full health target, so let's say we found an isolated battleship, but he's at full health, then our 2 torpedo bombers on an equalish tier, you know, so if we have a Shikaku and we're going against the Tirpitz of that, like, or a Bismarck, our 2 torpedo bombers and our 2 dive bombers, if we used all of them at the same time on the battleship, are not going to kill him. Yes, we'll do quite a bit of damage, we might get flooding, and then we could wait for the battleship to maybe do a damage control party, and then we could dive bomb, maybe we might get a fire or 2, or we could attack with all our planes at once and just alpha strike them. But at best we might get half maybe 2/3. It's kind of hard to say. By using a combination of, when we set up in episode 3, signals, we want to use the flooding signals and the fire signals. The reason we do this is damage over time stacking means rather than sending the bombers in pairs with themselves, we actually send one dive bomber and one torpedo bomber. Because if we just send dive bombers first, battleship players will allow their ship to burn because it's health that they can fully regenerate with the repair function. And they don't want to be forced into using their damage control party because that is bad for them, because then they become vulnerable to other elements of damage, multiple fires, floodings, that type of thing. So if you want to bait the damage control party and then get a much larger damage over time, because battleships damage control party can be around 60 seconds, we use one torpedo bomber, we use one dive bomber. The threat here is that any AA next to this battleship, belonging to the battleship, or hostile AA of other people, or fighter planes and whatnot, will focus the one torpedo bomber exclusively. Now, we only have 4 planes for Japanese. And the American carriers, unfortunately, don't have a second torpedo bomber squadron, so this doesn't necessarily work. And the Saipan, it doesn't necessarily work either because of the reduced number of planes and the chance of flooding. So this is more of a exclusively of a Japanese technique. Provided we have our flooding signals and we can drop the enemy battleship, get at least 2 or 3 connections with torpedoes, and drop dive bombers with fires, we will get at least 1 fire. And if we're lucky, because RNG can sometimes be, unkind to us, we'll get a flooding. If we have a fire and a flooding on the enemy battleship, well, this is bad for him, because now he's considering, well, oh no, this is bad, I'm going to have to damage control party. Almost 9 times out of 10, they will damage control party, unless, of course, they've already used it. And then they'll just keep taking damage. Look to the top right of your damage counter, keep looking. As soon as that number stops moving, or zoom in on the camera, have a look at the battleship himself, see if you can see the graphical effects of the fire. As soon as that's put out, and then he's stopped using his damage control party, you want to keep your second wave loitering, not far, not miles away, just outside his AA range. As soon as the damage control party has been used, immediately go back in with the second torpedo bomber and the second dive bomber, attack him again with the dive bombers, then the torpedo bombers, and if you are lucky, you will get a flooding. Now, the flooding chance is quite low for the torpedo bombers. The lowest of all the torpedo bombs is the torpedo bomber variants, which is why we use the signals to boost up the flooding chance that we can cause from torpedoes, and hitting the nose is a chance of flooding. We're not after Alpha Strike doing damage, we're after the dot. We want to do, like, we want to get a flooding. And if you time it right, you will get between 50 and 55 seconds of flooding damage and fire damage. Depending whether, if they've got skills to mitigate and put out the fire first and whatnot. But the point is, you do a huge amount of damage. If everything goes well and you get 2 or 3 torpedo connections from both waves, so up to 6 torpedoes, with floodings from both attempts and fires from both attempts, maybe the dive bomber gets 2 fires on the second attack, this ship will die. You can do a full health worth of damage to a battleship in one sort of bomber strike wave and kill it, as opposed to simply just getting half health or 2/3 health. This technique is useful because if it allows, and you can do it in game, and there's a ship that's isolated or full enough health, or you have the time to keep the second set of bomber waves away, he's not next to friendly AA, he's not sailing towards a defensive fire, he doesn't have enemy fighters coming in. If you can afford that level of patience, he's yours. You can totally kill him. So here, we're late into a random battle, and our Turpitz is offering a target. I don't believe, under the current circumstances, that we could kill this Turpitz by ourselves. But we can either damage him over time, or force this Turpitz into a broadside situation where he exposes himself to our friendly Turpitz. In this particular instance, I think I'm going to try a mixture of both. Watching the minimap just for other planes that are potentially incoming. See how we've already taken a plane loss. and he's already turning hard into the torpedo bombers. They may not activate, actually, now that I think about it. Oh no. Right, we've got flooding, so we've got fires. And the ship's turned broadside to our turpets. That's great. Now we're going to watch the damage control numbers. The damage control party has been used by the enemy. We're going to wait the time it takes for the damage control party to end, which is about 15 seconds. So it's going to end by the time we get back. So now we're going to go back on this turpets and reapply some fires and floods. If RNG is gentle to us. That's 2 fires, that's great. See if we can't get any flooding. So, the Alpha Strike wasn't enough to kill him, but the fire floodings was enough. And if he had his full health before we attacked him there, all of that damage would have triggered. And would have burned or flooded out, and we would have got the full kill there. Anyway, that concludes 2 elements here. One was forcing a ship to turn to expose broadside, and the second was using baiting damage control party and then applying fresh fire floodings to maximize one's damage to get a kill. The next topic I want to talk about briefly is ships that have exceptionally high maneuverability. Now these are perhaps French ones with engine boosts, but more so British cruisers. And we're talking here about forcing a ship turn. Now, if we have a friendly battleship over here, and I will come back to the friendly battleship in 2 seconds. First things first, if I am attempting to torpedo bomb this, and let's say we're using Hakuryu Tier 10 torpedo bombers, and this ship is a Minotaur. Minotaur is super maneuverable. It can accelerate through turns. So as we are trying to come from the broadside from behind, and we are approaching at the, and I'll try and use some arrows here. As we are approaching with our planes from behind, trying to get a perpendicular from behind, the hostile ship can just turn away. Ooh, oh wow. Clearly I've never used this tool before. I'll do that. So anyway, you get the kind of the purpose. I'm gonna see if I can find the bendy tool. Bendy tool. Never mind. So what I'm trying to get at basically is that the cruiser can turn away, and is very maneuverable, and he can damage. So rather than using all 3 bombers at once, we can fire 1 torpedo bomber wave, and this will launch a set of torpedoes at the cruiser. By launching a set of the cruiser will then turn to avoid the first set of planes. At that point, we can either then do another set, and this all comes down to how maneuverable it is to do another drop in that angle, and then the other wave we can also do a drop in this angle, or alternatively, we can continue to fly around with the bombers and attack again from this angle. The point I'm trying to get at here is that the cruiser itself is going to either take the damage and turn away or try and put into them, but if he is turning away, you can force a turn with the torpedo planes so that he travels in a predictable path. With the first wave going a predictable path, you can already have the second waves moving off at an angle, so you don't have them all grouped up. The first wave comes in, forces the turn, the second and third wave comes in and then makes the alternate drop. So as he's turned, he is now broadside to the next set of torpedoes that come in and takes a full connection. You have to obviously be aware that the ship could go in full circles and you might not hit him. It comes with experience, but ultimately you can force the player to move in a predictable path, similar to cross-dropping with destroyers. You're forcing the destroyer to act in a predictable line so you can hit him with the fallout waves. Highly maneuverable ships you can force to go in predictable paths so that you can attack them. Now, another useful technique of forcing ships to turn is if we have our Minotaur player, and let's say he is peppering this battleship of ours, he's not going to show broadside, he's going to be going north-south. So his sailing line is going to be going straight down, as an example. And we could also have a hostile battleship as well, for example. And this hostile battleship is sailing at an angle so that he does not need to expose broadside to our friendly battleship. So they're firing at him, and they're not exposing, the line of travel is that they're not exposing the broadsides. Well, what we can do if we feel that, you know, we can't necessarily kill our enemy ships, is we can send our bombers in from the side and then deliberately come at an angle so that the cruiser, instead of going south, will turn away to avoid the torpedo strike, and then by turning away, exposes broadside. Now this involves some communication with the friendly ships usually. You want to make sure that their guns are ready and they can do it, but the fact is you can force turns to force ships out of position to expose broadside, and if they don't turn to expose broadside, then you do torpedo damage. And this goes the same for the cruiser. The battleship that's sailing away, we come at them from behind, because if we come at them from the wrong direction, we'll force them away. That has no impact. We want to approach from a direction which will force him to turn away from the bombers or take hits from the bombers, so that he shows broadside to our team and can take more damage from our team shells. So that is a kind of forcing ships out of position for your own benefit to hit them, and forcing ships out of position so that friendly ships can attack them. In this classroom lesson in advanced bombing, we want to have a look at defensive fire baiting. So we're in a game, and the situation is such that we need to attack an AA cruiser, or a cruiser with a defensive fire. We have to kill him, we want to damage him, we want to fend him off, but we know he has a defensive fire, and we don't just want to attack him during the panic, do minimum damage, and lose planes. So what do? Well, we can attempt to bait out the defensive fire as we bait out, let's say, the damage control party from battleships. In this particular instance, if we feel that our planes are high enough health, or the ship doesn't have as good AA, so we don't have to send in all our planes at once to guarantee that at least some of them make it for the attack run, what we can do is initially we can send in our dive bombers. We can send in one at a time or two at a time. Ooh. Depending on the scenario, how strong the anti-air is, and we keep our torpedo bombers in reserve. What we're attempting to do here is damage the enemy cruiser with one or two dive bombers. The goal here is to force him to panic. Oh look, there's enemy planes incoming from you. Defensive fire. If the cruiser defensive fires immediately on the first dive bomber, that is fantastic. We can pull off with our dive bomber as much as possible. We wait the 40 seconds for the cruiser defensive fire to end, and then once the defensive fire is ended, we can then approach with all our planes and then make the attack. Usually when you're going after a cruiser with good strong A, you don't want to do anything else fancy. You just want to hit them as hard as you can. You know there's no defensive fire, so you approach from behind, as we've learned in previous episodes and tutorials, and hit the target as best we possibly can. Now, if the cruiser in question, enemy cruiser, does not defensive fire on the first dive bomber, that's fine. We hit him with the dive bombers, we cause some fires. Let the target burn. If the cruiser damage controls parties, your fire, or continues to burn, that's fine. At that point, you can send in the second dive bomber, or possibly even one torpedo bomber, but we kind of want to keep our torpedo bombers separate. What we're doing is we are bleeding out damage and health off the cruiser. If he's a good player, he'll be really stubborn about using his defensive fire, because he knows the real threat are the torpedo bombers. So we want to use one or two dive bombers to bleed out a damage control party, just to do damage, to let him burn over time. If he does use defensive fire, at that point we can send in the torpedo bombers. We can send in one torpedo bomber with one dive bomber if we want. The goal here is to cause a fire and a flooding. If it's a large ship, it's easier to hit. It's got a large health pool. Personally, however, when it comes to cruisers, I like to use one dive bomber at a time. I'm only realistically looking to cause and trigger some fires, or to cause a panic effect and cause a defensive fire. The other option is to highlight your torpedo bombers to approach the enemy cruiser at maximum range. Does he trigger the defensive fire at maximum range? If so, pull away immediately. The way to know if defensive fire has been triggered is to hold down the Alt button at all times. When your planes are on the approach to the enemy ship, make sure you have the Alt button held down so that you can see the targeting reticle. If the targeting green reticle goes massive and wide and spread out and panicked, you know he's used the defensive fire, pull off immediately. Japanese dive bombers are incredibly inefficient when it comes to the panic effect. There's no point bombing with them, you gotta pull them away. It's just a complete 1 in 100 that you hit anything. American dive bombers, you can in theory on a very large target, such as a tier 9-10 battleship, brute force your way through and get a couple of hits. Personally, I of course don't like that. I'd like to wait for the defensive fire to end, but you know, your mileage may vary. You may wish to do it elsewise. And then lastly, with the torpedo bombers, you basically want to hold them back as reserve. If you're desperate, or if you need to attack, or if your dive bombers have able to get fires and the cruiser has damage control party, even though he may not have defensive fired, it may be worth sending in the torpedo bombers now, because even if the enemy cruiser now uses the defensive fire and your planes are panicked, that's not what we're caring about, because now, even with a spread with 2 waves, we should be able to get 1 or 2 torpedoes to connect. And if we can get a flooding to stick, we'll do the damage that we originally were going to do in the first place, and we might get a kill. So that's defensive fire baiting, a little bit mixed in with damage control baiting, trying to get the cruiser to use these damage control party on our lesser planes, our weaker ones, so dive bombers. And if we can, great, we wait 40 seconds, we go into torpedo bombers. Failing that, we try and blood out as many fires on the target as possible, hurt him, and then send the torpedo bombers out after if he uses damage control party. Our last advanced topic that we want to talk about today is scout planes and how we can lure them with empty or less valuable planes such as dive bombers. Lure them away with empty dive bombers or with bombers that have actually got payload. So in this particular instance, we have an enemy battleship, could have 2 scout planes, or it could be a cruiser with 2 scout planes or 1 scout plane, depending if he has the skill. But the point is, if we attempt to go in with our torpedo bombers, it's almost the same as a defensive fire effect, because the scout plane, assuming the rotation is accurate, will come in and tag our plane, causing a panic effect. In order to compensate for this, we can either send in a full payload dive bomber first, which will be snagged by both of the enemy scout planes, or when I say scout planes, I mean like fighter scout planes. At that point, we can lure the dive bomber away from the trajectory of our bombers coming in, so that if anything happens to this dive bomber due to AA of the battleship or the attacking power of the 1 or 2 defensive fighters, catapult fighters of the target enemy ship, that the flight time for the defensive planes will be longer, because we're going to lure it away to the edge. There's a maximum operating sphere that the scout fighter catapult planes will operate on. And by luring them away or tagging them with an empty dive bomber or a dive bomber that has already dropped its payload and then peeled away, we can basically nullify the catapult fighters without having to use our own fighters. We quite possibly don't want to use our fighters in a sort of bomber protection role if we're expecting to fight the enemy carrier's fighters, or if we want to keep them alive, or having other roles, or perhaps our fighters are elsewhere in the map. If we have to attack a target where we don't have our fighters available or we don't want to use them, we can use a dive bomber, empty or otherwise, to fly over the enemy target, loiter, make sure both the catapult planes tag it, and then allowing us to move in with our bombers. That is basically an empty bomber or a scout plane lure, giving us the ability to attack with maximum efficiency. So earlier we spoke about unavoidable strikes. Here we are in a training room, and I'm just going to showcase how one can control the torpedo bombers and the kind of the spin and the turn and getting a close drop to work instead. So as an example, let's grab one torpedo bomber. When we want to manual attack by pressing the Alt button, if we give ourselves plenty of warning, we'll tie and lock in. And this lock in will happen, and when the plane gets close enough, the green reticle will turn yellow, and then the bombs will drop. How much we know. If we try and tell our torpedo bomber to drop too close, it will spin around. So if we're going for a target and we're like, oh hey, there's a ship here and I wanna torp him, but I have to tell him to drop here, because if I tell him to drop too far, he'll miss. I'll show you here in this North Carolina. It'll cause him to spin. Well, what we can do instead is, if I'm coming along and let's say there's a there's a dead zone, and you know it from your gut reaction. I do it well over in advance. We'll know here that this line here is roughly where the torpedo activation is. So the torpedoes need to be dropped this far back so that they can activate by this far. At the bare minimum. It's a kind of a gut reaction. You learn this. There's no like graphical indicator what the minimum activation range is, and it's slightly different from our American ones compared to Japanese. But there is a sort of bare minimum activation range for torps to activate. So if we are going for a target and we want to attack, and let's say this North Carolina, zoom in so we get a better view. If I'm approaching this enemy ship, well, if I want to drop here to guarantee a hit, I'll spin. And if I'm even closer, and if I want to guarantee a drop, I'll spin. However, what we can do is we can, through rapid clicking from further away and then shorter, I'll basically show here. So case in point, the plane would spin. However, if I go further away and then tap back, did you see that? They dropped instantly. What I did was, if I want to drop at this line, but it won't lock in because you'll spin, I tell the plane to lock in at this line, then immediately click it back. So once the green is locked in, I then shift click again, much closer. So as the torpedo bomber comes along, we'll do it again on the enemy ship. So here's the North Carolina. The planes are coming in, and it's a tight angle. I want to get the drops in as close as possible because I'm taking lots of anti-aircraft fire. So I'm coming along, and if I will click on the ship like so, and by clicking on the ship, obviously there'll be duds, but then I'll immediately pull it back and then click further back. Like that. That way, the range, the distance between activation and the ship are absolutely bare minimal. And it also means that you, using the torpedo bomber, can move into position. You can tell the torpedo bombers to attack the enemy ship, whereas normally they would spin around in a circle. By clicking further away, so again, we'll just go over it. By clicking further away and then pulling it back, you can force the torpedo bombers to drop instantaneously without spinning around in a circle. This is what I mean by ultra close range torpedo strikes. Conversely, as a side note, as a little bonus feature, this is the same for fighters. If you want to say there's an enemy strafe, so let's say my group number 2 is an enemy wave and it's coming towards my group number 1, well, if I wanted to strafe it and I clicked, the plane would spin around in a circle, because it's too close for the activation rate. It would spin around in a circle and then it would finally engage. However, if I do the exact same thing further away and then pull it back, he said, try that one more time. Oh, like that. See how that just triggered? Normally, we clicked right on top of the plane. We were right there. And rather than spinning around an approach, because we clicked further away, we let it lock in, and then we pulled it back. But it has to be like very snappy. Boom, like that. Tap, tap. And it works. So it works for fighter strafes and also works for torpedo bomber lock-in approaches. That's what I mean by ultra close unavoidable strikes, because you give the enemy ship minimal time to maneuver, minimal time to evade. The torpedoes activate on the literally pixels before they hit. Now that you would use this technique if the ship wasn't necessarily turning or whatnot, because it's very easy for the enemy ship to turn into you and then reduce the gap between your torpedo bombers and himself so that torpedoes don't activate, which is why I myself suffer from many torpedoes that are duds. But this is a really good system to approach a ship who is trying to evade you or making lots of turns and then lock in a bombing run that's very tight. The gap between your planes and the enemy ship is very, very close, but you can lock in the bombing run without having to do a big circle of your planes and then do another attack run, which would mean spending in like another 5-10 seconds inside the enemy A bubble, and you could lose all your planes. So anyway, this is unavoidable strikes. Well, this is the end of the advanced bombing 6.1 kind of episode video guide from Fara's Carrier Guide. I will in future, as it becomes available, when I receive extra clips, you know, kind of showcasing additional torpedo bomber strikes, additional defensive AA baiting, things that didn't necessarily were able to show a demonstration of in this video, we will put additional snippets up on my YouTube channel when they become available, when I get them, because they're not something that you can guarantee every random battle. They sort of come every once in a while. And we'll also put links into them on the World of Warships aircraft carrier forums, where I have my main thread for all of this material. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys. This is the end of this video. Coming up next will be topics such as 6.2, neutralizing enemy AA. We'll have another topic video on advanced fire control, and then advanced scouting, deck management, carrier sniping. We got a good video for that. Surviving a carrier snipe, air superiority, how do you deal with it, how do you deal with an enemy carrier that has more fighters than you, how to deal with being bottom tier, and what to do when everything goes bad. So those are all the subtopics of episode 6, which is advanced tactics in an aircraft carrier. As I said, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.